I don't want flowers. I don't want a priest. I don't want anyone sitting here crying over me like I'm already gone. Connor Hayes grabbed the nurse's wrist with the last strength his fingers could manage. I want the Hell's Angels. That's it. That's all I'm asking for. The nurse froze. The monitor beeped. And in that sterile room on the fourth floor of Spokane Memorial, a 17-year-old boy dying of bone cancer just made a request that would bring an entire city to its knees. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel right now and follow Connor's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The oncology ward at Spokane Memorial Hospital smelled the way all oncology wards smell: antiseptic over something older and heavier, something no cleaning solution could ever fully reach. Connor Hayes had been breathing that smell for 11 weeks. He knew every sound the fourth floor made at 3 in the morning. The hiss of the ventilation system, the soft roll of the medication cart down the linoleum hallway, the way the night nurses talk to each other in that careful, quiet register people use when they're surrounded by dying. He was 17 years old and he weighed 109 pounds. The bone cancer had started in his left femur 14 months ago. By the time the doctors at Spokane Memorial finished explaining the staging to his mother, Sarah, it had already moved. It moved through him the way a fire moves through an old house, systematically without mercy, consuming everything it touched. By November, it was in his spine. By February, his ribs. By the time spring arrived and the cherry trees outside his window bloomed pink and indifferent, the cancer was everywhere that mattered. Dr. Elaine Marsh had sat across from Sarah Hayes 3 days ago, with the particular stillness of a woman who had delivered this kind of news more times than any human being should have to. She didn't use soft language. Sarah had asked her not to. "We're measuring in days now," Dr. Marsh said. "Not weeks, days. I want you to think about what Connor needs most in the time he has left." Sarah had nodded. She had gotten very good at nodding. What she hadn't expected was what Connor needed. He told her on a Tuesday afternoon when the light through the window was doing something almost gentle across his blanket and his pain medication had leveled him into something close to calm. He reached under his pillow and pulled out a coin. It was silver, or had been once. Now it was worn smooth on one side from years of handling. On the other side, a symbol Sarah recognized immediately and had spent 17 years trying not to think about: the death's head, the wings, the words circling the edge in letters she knew by memory, even though she'd never wanted to. Hell's Angels. "Mom," Connor said. His voice had changed in the last 2 weeks. It had gotten quieter and somehow more deliberate, like every word now cost him something he couldn't afford to waste. "I want to meet them." Sarah looked at the coin. She looked at her son. She said very carefully, "Connor, I know what you're going to say. You don't know what I'm going to say. You're going to say it's not safe, or it's not appropriate, or you're going to go talk to one of the counselors and they're going to come in here and ask me if I want to reconsider." He turned his head toward the window. The cherry blossoms were doing their soft, useless thing outside. "I'm not reconsidering." Sarah held the coin in her palm. It was heavier than it looked. "Where did you get this?" The pause that followed was longer than it should have been. Connor was deciding something. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes moved away from hers. "It was Dad's," he said. The word landed in the room and didn't go away. Sarah had not spoken about Michael Hayes in any substantive way for the better part of a decade. She had not lied to Connor. She had simply answered every question with the minimum viable truth. "Your father left when you were 4. He had problems he couldn't solve. He loved you." That last part she believed, or had trained herself to believe, because it was the part Connor needed and because the alternative was something she couldn't give her dying son. "Connor, your father. Was he one of them?" Connor looked at her directly then, and the directness of it hit her somewhere behind the sternum. "Was he a Hell's Angel? Is that where this came from? Because I've had this coin my whole life, and I've looked it up, and I know what it means, and I need you to tell me the truth." Sarah opened her mouth. She closed it. "I need to know who he was," Connor said. Before I go, Mom, I need to know." She left the room to find a nurse, not because she needed a nurse, because she needed 30 seconds in a hallway to remember how to breathe. The conversation with Dr. Patricia Wellman, the hospital's palliative care coordinator, happened 40 minutes later. Dr. Wellman was a compact, careful woman in her mid-50s who wore her gray hair in a precise bun and had a reputation on the ward for being both deeply compassionate and professionally immovable. She listened to Sarah's explanation with her hands folded on her desk and her expression arranged into something neutral and attentive. When Sarah finished, Dr. Wellman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I understand how meaningful this request is to Connor, and I want you to know that we take every patient's end-of-life wishes with complete seriousness." "But," Sarah said, "the Hells Angels are a designated outlaw motorcycle club with a documented history of criminal activity. Bringing members of that organization into a medical facility, into a ward where we have vulnerable patients, many of them elderly, many of them in critical condition, that's not a decision I can make unilaterally." She paused. "And frankly, Mrs. Hayes, it's not a decision I can make at all. The hospital administrator would need to be involved, risk management, potentially legal." "He's 17 years old and he's dying," Sarah said. The flatness in her own voice surprised her. "I know that." Dr. Wellman's voice was genuinely soft. "And I'm sorry, I'm truly sorry. But there are other patients in this building whose safety I'm also responsible for. There are other families here, and I have to think about all of them." "His father may have been a member," Sarah said. "He found a coin. He wants to know who his father was. That's what this is about." Something shifted in Dr. Wellman's expression. Just slightly, just enough to tell Sarah the woman understood more than she was letting on. "Can we talk about alternatives?" Dr. Wellman said. "There may be other ways to help Connor understand his father's history. A therapist, perhaps. Or we could look into—" "He doesn't want a therapist." Sarah stood up. "He wants the Hells Angels." She walked out of the office and stood in the corridor and looked at the door to Connor's room 30 feet away and thought about the coin in her jacket pocket and thought about Michael and thought about all the years she had spent not thinking about Michael and felt something in her chest that wasn't grief exactly and wasn't anger exactly, but was made out of both of those things and several others she didn't have names for. Then she went back to her son's room and sat in the chair beside his bed and held his hand and told him she was working on it. She wasn't working on it, not yet, but she would be. The next morning she went to see Richard Calloway. Richard Calloway was the hospital's chief administrator, and he operated from an office on the second floor that was aggressively normal in its furnishings, framed diplomas, a plant that was doing better than most of the patients upstairs, a desk that suggested authority without excess. He was 61 with the permanently preoccupied expression of a man who spent his days navigating the space between what was right and what was insurable. He heard Sarah out. He was polite about it. He offered her coffee twice, which she declined twice. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "Mrs. Hayes, I want to be sensitive to your situation, and I genuinely sympathize with what you and Connor are going through." "I hear a but coming," Sarah said. "The Hells Angels are a criminal organization. Their members have felony convictions. Bringing them into this facility would expose the hospital to liability that I simply cannot authorize. Beyond the legal exposure, we have to think about the atmosphere in the ward. We have patients here who are frightened, who are fragile. The sight of," he paused, choosing his word, "that kind of group in this building could cause genuine psychological distress to other patients and their families." "His name is Connor Hayes," Sarah said. "He's in room 414. He's 17 years old. He has days, not weeks. Days." She paused. "He has never asked for anything from this hospital that wasn't medically necessary. Not once in 11 weeks has he made a single unreasonable request. This is the one thing he wants." Calloway's expression was sympathetic in the way that institutional expressions of sympathy always are, genuine in its way, but ultimately not movable by sentiment alone. "I understand," he said, "and I wish I could do more, but my answer has to be no." Sarah walked back upstairs. She passed Dr. Wellman's office without stopping. She passed the nurse's station where two nurses pretended not to watch her face. She went into Connor's room and sat down and looked at her son, who was asleep, and looked at the coin on his bedside table and understood that the hospital was not going to solve this problem, which meant she was. She waited until visiting hours ended and the night shift settled into its rhythms. She waited until Connor's pain medication pulled him under and his breathing evened out and the room got quiet in the particular way hospital rooms get quiet when everyone in them has temporarily let go of the effort of being awake. Then she looked up the Hells Angels Spokane chapter on her phone. She found very little that was useful. A few news articles, a reference to a clubhouse location in the industrial district east side of the city near the rail yards. Nothing that told her what to expect. Nothing that told her what she was walking into. She put her phone in her pocket, looked at her son one more time, and pulled her jacket off the back of the chair. She wrote a note for the night nurse that said she'd be back by morning. She left her cell number. She put the coin in her jacket pocket and zipped it shut. Then she walked out of Spokane Memorial into the April night and got into her car and drove east. The drive took 22 minutes. She spent most of it thinking about Michael Hayes, the version of him she'd married, young and reckless and magnetic in the way that certain kinds of dangerous things are magnetic. She'd known something was off. She told herself everyone has edges they don't show you right away. She'd told herself a lot of things in those years. Then he was gone, and the things she'd told herself became the architecture she built Connor's childhood inside of careful insulating, designed to keep the questions from getting too loud. The coin had always been there. She'd known about it. She'd never taken it from him because she couldn't explain why she would, and because some part of her had always believed that Connor would one day need something she didn't know how to give him, and the coin might be part of the answer she couldn't provide herself. She just hoped one day wouldn't come like this. The clubhouse was set back from the street behind a chain-link fence that had been reinforced with something heavier and less official looking. The gate was closed, lights burned behind frosted windows. She could hear music from inside, though hear wasn't quite the right word. She could feel it more than hear it, a bass frequency that seemed to come up through the car's frame. She sat in the parking lot for 45 seconds. Then she got out of the car. The man at the gate was very large, with arms that had been built rather than grown, and a beard that had been growing long enough that it had started making its own decisions. He wore a black leather vest over a dark flannel shirt, and the death's head patch on his chest was the same image as the one on the coin in her pocket. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has seen many unexpected things arrive at this gate and has long since stopped being surprised by any of them. "We're closed," he said. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge," Sarah said. "Not how this works. My son is dying." She said it without preamble, without softening, because she had discovered in the last 11 weeks that the sentence worked differently when you stopped treating it like something fragile. "He has days. He found a coin with your symbol on it. He thinks his father was a member. His name was Michael Hayes, and my son's last wish is to meet the Hells Angels, and I will stand here all night if that's what it takes." The man at the gate looked at her for a long time. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. He said, "Wait here." He went inside. Sarah stood in the April cold and listened to the bass from inside the building and held the coin through the fabric of her jacket pocket and thought about Connor's face when he said, "I need to know who he was." 8 minutes later, the gate opened. "Someone will see you," the man said. The inside of the clubhouse was nothing like what Sarah had built in her imagination. It was large and loud and lit with the particular intensity of a place that has decided it doesn't care what outsiders think of it. There were men playing pool, men at the bar, men talking in groups with the posture of people who have known each other long enough that conversation has become something they do with their whole bodies. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and beer, and something underneath both of those, something older and more specific that Sarah associated with garages and machinery. Every head turned when she walked in, not aggressively, not threateningly, just the complete unhurried attention of a room that doesn't often have this particular kind of visitor. The man who came to meet her was not what she expected. She had constructed without meaning to a mental image of a Hells Angels president, massive, brutal-looking, built from intimidation, the way other men are built from education or money. Thomas Henderson was big, yes, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, with hands that had clearly done serious work at some point, and a gray beard trimmed close enough to suggest a man who still believed in maintaining something. His hair was gray, too, swept back from a face that wore its years honestly. He was maybe 60, maybe a few years either side. He looked at her with eyes that were considerably more attentive than she had prepared herself for. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. His voice was level and deep, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to carry. "I'm Grizzly. Come sit down." She sat across from him at a table in the corner of the room. Two other men positioned themselves nearby, not threateningly, but with the specific practiced casualness of men who are there for a reason. Grizzly looked at her. "Talk." So she talked. She told him about Connor, about the cancer, about the timeline, about the coin, and the question her son had been carrying for years and had finally decided he needed answered before he ran out of time to ask it. She told him about the hospital's refusal. She told him about sitting in the parking lot for 45 seconds before getting out of the car. She didn't know why she included that last part, but she did. When she finished, Grizzly was quiet. He hadn't moved much while she spoke. He had the stillness of a man who had learned to listen as a survival skill. "Show me the coin," he said. She put it on the table between them. He looked at it for a long moment without picking it up. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't read precisely. Then he picked it up, turned it over, once set it back down. "Michael Hayes," he said. "You knew him." It wasn't a question, and she hadn't meant it to be. She could see the answer already in the way he said the name, in the way he looked at the coin, in the specific quality of the silence that followed. "I knew him," Grizzly said. "My son wants to know who his father was. He thinks your club can tell him something I can't." Grizzly looked at her steadily. "Why can't you tell him?" "Because I don't know the whole story," Sarah said. "And because what I do know," she stopped. Started again. "Michael left when Connor was 4. He didn't say goodbye. There was no explanation, no note, nothing. 3 months later, I found out from a mutual acquaintance that he was dead. I don't know how. I've never been able to find out how. I know it wasn't an accident." She paused. "I think Connor deserves to know the shape of his father's life, even if the shape is ugly." Grizzly was looking at the coin again. "That's a generous way to think about it." "He's dying," Sarah said simply. Generosity seems like the right approach. Something that might have been respect moved briefly across Grizzly's face. "How old is he?" said. 17. "What's he like?" The question surprised her. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to answer questions about Connor. "He's the smartest person I know," she said. "He's been reading since he was 3. He spent 6 months teaching himself to play guitar because he wanted to learn one specific song. He's kind in a way that doesn't call attention to itself. He doesn't complain." Her voice stayed level. She'd gotten good at that too. "He's the most stubborn person I've ever met, which is saying something because I'm not exactly flexible myself. He decided 6 months ago that if he was going to die, he was going to die curious, not afraid." Grizzly looked at her for a moment. "Decided he wanted to meet us and just decided that. Wouldn't let go of it." "That's right. Even when the hospital said no. Especially when the hospital said no." Something shifted in Grizzly's face, a very slight movement, but real. He picked up the coin one more time, and this time he held it rather than immediately setting it back down. "Michael Hayes," he said again, quieter this time, more private. "He was with us for almost 3 years, prospect period included." He turned the coin over in his fingers. "He was charismatic, could talk anyone into anything. Good with engines, better with people. The kind of man who makes a room better just by walking into it." He set the coin down. "He was also a thief." The word dropped into the space between them. Sarah kept her face still. "He stole from the club," Grizzly said. "Not once. Over a period of months. Money that belonged to members to the chapter. He had debts we didn't know about from before he was with us. He thought he could fix it quietly. He couldn't." He looked at her directly. "When it came out, he ran, skipped town. 3 months later, someone caught up with him. It wasn't us. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't the club, but Michael Hayes made enemies beyond just us, and the life he'd been living had a bill that came due." Sarah absorbed this slowly, the way cold water absorbs into fabric. "So he wasn't a good man," Grizzly said. Not harshly, just plainly. "He had good qualities, plenty of them, but when it counted, he made choices that destroyed what he had. His debts weren't just money. He burned people who trusted him. And he left." He paused. "He left you and a 4-year-old kid." Sarah's hands were flat on the table. She looked at them. "Connor doesn't know any of this." "What does Connor know?" "That his father was gone, that he had problems, that he loved him." She looked up. "I gave him the version that a child could survive. Now he's not a child anymore, and he's running out of time to be anything, and he's asking me for the version that's true." Grizzly was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What exactly does your son want from us?" "He wants to meet you," Sarah said. "That's what he says. I think he wants to understand something about the world his father came from. He's been carrying that coin his whole life. He wants to know what it meant. He wants to know if his father was part of something real." Part of something real, Grizzly repeated. Those were his words. Another silence. Grizzly picked up the coin one final time and held it in his palm for a moment. Then he set it gently on Sarah's side of the table. The hospital won't let us in, he said. No. What floor is he on? Fourth, room 414. Grizzly looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, and the two men who had been positioned nearby straightened almost imperceptibly. Go back to your son, Grizzly said. Be with him. Sarah stood. She picked up the coin. She looked at him directly. Is that all you're going to tell me? Go back to your son, Mrs. Hayes. She drove back across the city, in the dark, the coin in her hand on the steering wheel. Her eyes on the road, her mind moving through what she'd heard and what it meant, and what she was going to tell Connor, which she still didn't know. The truth was that Michael Hayes had been a thief and a coward who burned everyone who loved him and died alone because of choices he'd made freely. The truth was brutal and irreducible and sat in her chest like a stone. The truth was her son was dying and had asked her for one thing. She got back to the hospital at 2 a.m. The night nurse at the desk gave her a look that was more relief than reproach. She walked down the corridor to 414 and opened the door carefully and stepped inside. Connor was awake. She hadn't expected that. He was lying in the same position, but his eyes were open and tracking toward her the moment the door moved. Where did you go? He said. She sat down in the chair. She looked at her son's face in the dim light, at the bones that had become too visible, at the eyes that were still, even now, even still more alive than seemed fair, given everything else. She made a decision. I went to find some answers, she said, and she opened her hand. The coin sat in her palm. She set it on the table beside his bed where he could see it. Get some sleep, she said. I'll be here in the morning. Connor looked at the coin. He looked at his mother. Something in his face, not resignation exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that understood she wasn't ready to talk yet, settled quietly. Okay, he said. She sat in the chair. She listened to his breathing. She thought about Grizzly, saying, go back to your son. She turned the words over in her mind the specific way he'd said them, and not dismissive, not a goodbye. Something else, something she couldn't quite pin down yet. Outside the 4th floor window, the cherry trees were invisible in the dark. Sarah Hayes stayed awake all night with her son, listening to him breathe, and waited to find out what she'd set in motion. Dawn came into room 414, the way it always did, indifferent, slow filtering through the blinds in thin bars that crossed Connor's blanket without warming anything. Sarah had not slept. She knew she hadn't slept because she had been aware of every single minute between 2 a.m. and 6:15 when the day shift nurse knocked twice and opened the door and checked Connor's vitals with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to move through grief-saturated rooms without disturbing the air too much. Connor's numbers were worse than yesterday. The nurse didn't say that, but Sarah had learned to read the small pause before the notation, the fraction of a second where a professional composure gets tested and holds, and she knew. Connor opened his eyes at 6:40. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then turned his head toward his mother. You didn't sleep, he said. I slept. Mom? A little, she said. He almost smiled. It was the ghost of a smile, the architectural suggestion of one, but it was real. What did you find out last night? She had been thinking about this question for 4 hours. She had organized and reorganized her answer, discarded several versions, and arrived finally at the only approach that felt sustainable: honesty about what she'd done, partial silence about what she'd heard. I went to the clubhouse, she said. Connor's eyes sharpened immediately. Whatever medication was moving through his system, it wasn't enough to dull that. You went there alone? You weren't available. Mom, that could have been dangerous. You can't just... Connor. She said his name quietly and he stopped. I'm your mother. I drove across town to talk to strangers because you asked me to. That's a fairly ordinary Tuesday for me at this point. He stared at her. Something moved across his face that she recognized as the particular frustration of someone who loves a person they can't protect. She knew the feeling intimately, had lived inside it for 11 months. What happened? He said. I spoke with the man who runs the chapter, Thomas Henderson. They call him Grizzly. She paused. He knew who your father was. The stillness that settled over Connor then was different from sleep stillness or medication stillness. It was the stillness of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has just heard the first note of it. And he said to go back to my son. She looked at Connor directly. That's what he said. I don't know what it means yet, but he said it like it meant something. Connor was quiet. He looked at the coin on the bedside table. His hand moved toward it slowly, the way all his movements were slow now, and his fingers closed around it. He's going to come, Connor said. Not a question. I don't know that. I do. He held the coin against his palm. I've always known they would come if I asked the right way. I just didn't know how to ask. How to. Sarah looked at her son and felt the particular terror of a parent watching a child believe in something she couldn't guarantee. She had spent 17 years trying to protect Connor from disappointments she could see coming. She had not always succeeded. This one felt enormous. Connor, don't, he said gently, don't tell me to manage my expectations. Not now. She closed her mouth. She reached out and put her hand over his over the coin, and they sat like that in the thin morning light while the hospital began its daily business of noise and motion around them. Dr. Marsh arrived at 8:15 and did not stay long. She adjusted 2 medications, spoke briefly to Sarah in the corridor about comfort measures and timeline, and left with the measured pace of a woman carrying more weight than she showed. What she said in that corridor, in a voice pitched low enough that the passing nurses couldn't hear, was, I'd estimate 72 hours, possibly fewer. I think you should make whatever calls need to be made. Sarah made exactly 1 call. She went to the hospital chapel, which was empty at that hour, and stood near the window with her phone and called the number she'd gotten from the gate guard the night before, a number she'd been given, with the implicit understanding that she probably shouldn't need to use it, but could. It rang 4 times. She was composing a voicemail in her head when the line connected. Mrs. Hayes, Grizzly's voice. Fully awake, though it was barely 8:30. 72 hours, she said. The doctor told me this morning, 72 hours, maybe less. A silence. Not empty, she could hear him breathing, could hear some ambient sound on his end that she couldn't identify. He had a good night, Grizzly said. The question surprised her. He was awake this morning. He's lucid. More lucid than he should be, probably. What did you tell him? That I'd spoken to you, that you knew his father. She paused. He thinks you are coming. Another silence. The hospital administrator won't budge, Grizzly said. I know. Calloway. The fact that he knew the man's name gave Sarah a small, cold jolt. How do you... We have people in this city, Mrs. Hayes. We've had them for 30 years. I know who Richard Calloway is. A pause. He's also wrong. He has liability concerns. He has liability concerns, Grizzly said, and the flatness in his voice when he repeated the phrase communicated clearly what he thought of liability concerns as a category of human priority. Your son is dying, and Richard Calloway has liability concerns. He's not going to change his mind, Sarah said. I've already. Let me worry about Calloway, Grizzly said. What does that mean? It means go be with your son, Mrs. Hayes, like I told you last night. A pause. Stop trying to solve problems that aren't yours to solve right now. The line went quiet. Sarah stood in the empty chapel and looked at her phone and then put it back in her pocket and went upstairs. What happened next she didn't witness directly. She pieced it together later, from fragments, from things the nurses told her, from what Connor's day nurse described, from the particular sequence of expressions on Richard Calloway's face when she passed him in the corridor that afternoon. Grizzly had called Calloway at 9 that morning. She didn't know exactly what was said. What she knew was that Calloway emerged from his office at 9:45 with an expression that suggested the conversation had not gone the way he expected, and that he spent the next 2 hours on the phone with the hospital's legal team. She knew this because the senior floor nurse, a woman named Denise, who had been on the oncology ward for 19 years and had developed opinions about hospital administrators that she was willing to share with the mother of a dying patient, told her. Whatever's happening, Denise said, lowering her voice at the nurse's station. Calloway is having a very bad morning, and personally, I don't feel bad about it. At noon, Connor's regular nurse, a young man named Tyler, who wore cartoon dog scrubs and had become something like a gentle fixed point in Connor's days, came into the room with a face that was carefully neutral in the way faces are carefully neutral when they're containing something. Dr. Wellman is going to stop by later, Tyler said, adjusting Connor's IV drip with practiced hands. She wants to check in. She came by yesterday, Connor said. She's very thorough. Connor looked at Tyler with the focused attention of someone who has gotten very good at reading subtlety. Something's happening, isn't it? I'm just here for the IV, Tyler said pleasantly and left. Connor looked at his mother. Something's happening. I don't know, Sarah said, which was not entirely true. Dr. Wellman arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She sat in the chair across from the bed, the chair Sarah usually occupied, which Sarah had vacated to stand near the window, and she folded her hands and looked at Connor with the particular careful attention of a woman who is working through something complicated in real time. Connor, she said, I want to talk to you about your wish. Connor's expression didn't change. Okay. There have been some conversations happening today about your request at the administrative level. She paused. Mr. Calloway is, another pause briefer, reconsidering some of the parameters of our initial response. Connor looked at her steadily. You're saying they might let them come. I'm saying the conversation is ongoing. Because of my mom, Dr. Wellman glanced at Sarah for just a moment. Your mother has been a very strong advocate, yes. And because of them, Connor said, because the club is pushing back. Dr. Wellman's carefully neutral expression developed a small crack along one edge. There have been some communications from outside the hospital, yes. Connor almost smiled again. Grizzly called him. Connor. Good, Connor said quietly. Good. Dr. Wellman left at 2:40. Sarah could hear from the corridor the sound of raised voices somewhere down near the administrative wing, not clearly enough to make out words, just the unmistakable register of institutional argument. She recognized Calloway's voice. The other voice she didn't know. Tyler came back at 3 with Connor's afternoon medications. He was working very hard at his neutral face. He set the medications on the table, checked the monitor readings, made a notation. Tyler, Connor said. Yep. What's going on in the building? Tyler looked at Connor. He looked at Sarah. He appeared to conduct an internal negotiation. There's a gentleman from the county, he said carefully, who is currently in a meeting with Mr. Calloway and 2 people from legal and Dr. Wellman. That's all I know. He left. Connor was quiet for a moment. A gentleman from the county, he repeated. Don't read too much into it, Sarah said. A gentleman from the county showed up at a private hospital on a Wednesday afternoon. Connor turned his head toward the window. That's not nothing, Mom. It was not nothing. Sarah understood that. She understood it even more clearly at 4:15 when Richard Calloway knocked on the door of room 414 and came inside. She had never seen him come to the floor before. That alone was enough. He stood near the door, not quite entering the room fully, and looked at Connor with an expression that was doing several different things at once. Connor, he said, how are you feeling today? About the same as yesterday, Connor said, which is not great. Mr. Calloway, right? Calloway looked slightly surprised to be recognized. That's right. My mom told me about your meeting. Connor's voice was quiet and level. You said no. A pause. The situation has evolved since then. Has it? Calloway moved slightly further into the room. He looked at Sarah briefly, then back at Connor. I want you to know that everything we do in this hospital, every decision we make, is in the interest of patient welfare. All of our patients, including you. He stopped. Whatever speech he had prepared seemed to be failing him in the actual presence of the person he had prepared it for. Connor had that effect. Sarah had noticed it with doctors too, the way her son's directness. The economy of a person who could no longer afford to waste time on anything false had a way of making rehearsed language feel suddenly inadequate. What changed, Connor said. Calloway cleared his throat. We've been in contact with representatives of the organization and with some county offices, and there are certain logistical arrangements that can be made that would address our primary concerns. Connor looked at him. So they can come. Another pause, longer this time. Under specific conditions and with appropriate security arrangements. Can they come, Connor said. Just the question, nothing around it. Calloway looked at this 17-year-old boy in a hospital bed, 63 pounds below a healthy weight, with bones that were failing him cell by cell, and his institutional vocabulary appeared to evaporate entirely. Yes, he said quietly, they can come. Connor closed his eyes. He didn't say anything for a moment. His hand was still wrapped around the coin, and Sarah watched his fingers tighten around it slightly. Not a fist, just a grip. The grip of someone holding on to something they thought they might lose. Thank you, Connor said. His voice was very quiet. Calloway nodded. He looked at Sarah for a moment, an awkward look, not quite apologetic, but in the general vicinity, and then he left. Tyler appeared in the doorway approximately 90 seconds later, with an expression he'd completely given up trying to control. So he said? So Connor said. For the record, Tyler said, I have been rooting for you this whole time. I know, Connor said. The cartoon dogs gave you away. Tyler laughed a real laugh, quick and helpless, and then got himself back together and went to check on the readings and pretended to be professional about it. Sarah sat back down in her chair. She looked at her son. He had opened his eyes again and was staring at the ceiling with an expression she hadn't seen on him in a long time. Not peace exactly. Something more active than peace. Mom, he said. Yeah. When do you think they'll come? I don't know. I'll try to reach Grizzly. Tell him, he stopped. Tell him I'm running out of time. Tell him I know that's obvious, but tell him anyway. I will. She called from the hallway. Grizzly picked up on the second ring. Calloway came to the room himself, she said. He told Connor they can come. A sound from Grizzly that might have been satisfaction, though he kept it brief. Good. Connor wants me to tell you he's running out of time. A pause. I know. Tonight, tomorrow. We'll come when we come, Mrs. Hayes. Tell your son to rest. A pause. Tell him we heard him. She went back into the room and told Connor they heard you. Connor nodded. He looked at the coin in his hand. Good, he said softly. Good. He fell asleep at 5:30 earlier than usual, and Sarah sat beside him and watched the monitors and listened to his breathing and tried to measure each one against the last, trying to know, without being able to know if there were more of them or fewer. The night nurse came in at 7. Her name was Renata, and she had the quiet, grounded energy of a woman who had been doing this for a long time and had made a particular peace with the weight of it. She checked Connor's vitals and made her notations and looked at Sarah with genuine warmth. You should eat something, she said. I'm fine. Mrs. Hayes. I know, I will. Renata finished her checks and moved toward the door, then stopped. She turned back. There's something going on outside, she said. In the parking structure area and on the access road. I don't know exactly what yet, but the security desk called up about 20 minutes ago. She kept her voice level and factual. I thought you'd want to know. Sarah looked at Connor. He was asleep. The coin was still in his hand. She stood up slowly. What kind of something, she said. Renata measured her words carefully. The kind with engines, she said. Sarah moved to the window. The 4th floor window faced the east side of the building, overlooking the access road and the edge of the parking structure beyond it. The night had come down fully by now, and the lighting on that side of the building was industrial and sparse. But she could see them. Not all of them. She couldn't see all of them from here. But she could see the leading edge of something enormous moving slowly through the access road, a column of headlights and running lights that extended back far enough that she couldn't see where it ended. She could hear it now, too, through the window glass. Not the individual sounds of engines, but the collective sound of them, a low, continuous roar that had a frequency and a weight that she felt somewhere under her sternum. She had never seen anything like it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. Grizzly, she answered. Look out your window, he said. I am. All of them, he said. Every chapter we could reach in 48 hours. Some drove through the night. A pause. Nobody told them they had to come. We put the word out and they came. Sarah pressed her hand flat against the window glass. How many, she said. Right now, a pause. Little over 300, more coming. She couldn't speak for a moment. Mrs. Hayes? Grizzly's voice quieter now. We heard your son. Tell him we heard him. She lowered the phone and turned around, and Connor was awake. She didn't know when he'd woken up. He was lying in the same position, but his eyes were open and they were pointed at her face with an intensity that the medication should have made impossible. What's that sound? He said. His voice had changed from this morning. Thinner, further away. Sarah crossed the room to his bed. She sat down beside him, not in the chair, but on the edge of the mattress. She took his hand, the one with the coin, and held it carefully. Connor, she said. I can hear engines, he said. Mom, I can hear engines. I know. Are they? He stopped, swallowed, the effort visible. Are they here? She looked at her son's face. At 17 years of a life that had been shorter than it should have been, and brighter in its way than she'd ever had the right to expect. At the coin between his fingers, at the question in his eyes that had been there since he was 4 years old and first understood that the space where his father should have been was empty. "They're here," she said. Connor closed his eyes. From somewhere below, through the floors and the walls and the window glass, the sound of 300 engines moved through the building like a second heartbeat, steady, massive, impossible to ignore. The nurses at the station heard it. The patients in the adjacent rooms heard it. Dr. Wellman, who was doing late rounds, stopped in the hallway and looked at the window and was quiet for a long moment. Richard Calloway, in his office on the second floor, sat at his desk and heard it and did not pick up the phone. Tyler came to the door of 414 and looked in. Connor's eyes were still closed. Sarah was holding his hand. The sound from outside filled the room the way music fills a room, not just in your ears, but in the space between everything. "Is he?" Tyler started. "He's okay," Sarah said. "He's listening." Tyler nodded. He put his hand briefly on the door frame and then stepped back into the hallway and left them alone. Connor's fingers tightened around the coin. "They came for me," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," Sarah said. 300 people who never met me." "Yes." A long silence. The engines below, steady and enormous. "Tell me something real about him," Connor said. "My dad, not the safe version, something true." Sarah Hayes had been dreading this moment for 17 years. She had prepared for it in 100 different ways, and none of the preparations felt right, and she was sitting on the edge of her dying son's hospital bed with the sound of Hell's Angels filling the night around them, and she understood finally that there was no version of this that could be made comfortable. There was only what was true and what was merciful, and the question of how much overlap existed between those two things. She thought about what Grizzly had said. He was charismatic, could talk anyone into anything, good with engines, better with people, the kind of man who makes a room better just by walking into it. She thought about Michael Hayes at 26 the year she met him, the way he laughed, the way he'd been with Connor as a baby, genuinely gentle, genuinely present in a way that had surprised her because it was real. She thought he was also a thief and a coward who burned everyone who loved him and left his 4-year-old son without a goodbye. Both things were true. Both things were Michael. "He was the most alive person I'd ever met," she said. "When you walked into a room with him, you felt it, like something turned up. He could make strangers feel like they'd known him for years." She paused. "He was also broken in ways I didn't understand until too late. He made choices that hurt people. He ran from things instead of facing them. He was not who I needed him to be." Connor was listening, eyes still closed. "But he wasn't nothing," Sarah said. "He was complicated. He was real. And some of what he was, the alive part, the stubborn part, the part that doesn't give up." Her voice held. "That's in you. That's been in you your whole life." Connor didn't speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was very quiet. Was the coin his yes? Did he love me? The question she had been asked 100 times before, in 100 different forms over 17 years. She had always answered it the same way because she had always believed the answer. Yes, she said. Whatever else he was, that was true. The engines outside shifted, not fading but changing register, settling into something steadier and lower. The city around the hospital had gotten quieter. It was late enough that the normal street noise had thinned, and the sound of the riders was the dominant thing in the night. Connor opened his eyes. "I want to see them," he said. "Connor, you can't—" "I know I can't go outside." He turned his head toward her. "Can they come up?" Sarah thought of Grizzly's voice. "We'll come when we come. Tell him to rest." She thought of 300 riders who had driven through the night without being told they had to. She picked up her phone, but before she could dial, her phone rang. "Grizzly," she answered. "We're outside," he said. "I'm coming in. The security has been handled." A pause. "Calloway made some arrangements, like I said he would." Another pause, and in it, something she hadn't heard in his voice before, something careful, almost gentle. "I'm going to need a few minutes with your son, Mrs. Hayes, alone. I need you to trust me with that." Sarah looked at Connor. Connor was looking at her, and in his face, past the illness, past the exhaustion, past everything that the last 11 months had stripped away, she could see the 4-year-old boy who used to ask her why the space where his father should have been was empty. "Don't hurt him," she said. Not a warning, something else. A request from one human being to another. No, Grizzly said. I'm not going to hurt him. The wait between the phone call and the moment the door opened was 11 minutes. Sarah spent them in the chair by the window, and Connor spent them watching the door. Neither of them spoke much. Tyler came by once and then quickly away reading the room. At 9:47, the door to room 414 opened. Thomas Grizzly Henderson was not wearing his vest when he walked in. He was carrying it folded over one arm. He had cleaned up from the night before, or maybe simply looked different in this context, in this light, in this room. He walked in the way large men with authority walk in quiet rooms, carefully aware of the space. He looked at Connor. Connor looked at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The monitor beeped. The engine sounds from outside, lower, now steadier, moved through the glass. You're Connor, Grizzly said. You're Grizzly, Connor said. Grizzly pulled the chair from the corner of the room and set it beside the bed and sat down. He set the vest across his knees. He looked at Connor with the same attentiveness he'd given Sarah in the clubhouse, the listening that went past the surface. Your mom drove into our clubhouse alone at midnight, Grizzly said. I know. She's insane. She is, Grizzly agreed. Something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. I've met a lot of people who wanted things badly enough to do something stupid to get them. Your mother is in the top 5. Connor looked at his mother. Sarah raised an eyebrow at him. He almost smiled back. You wanted to meet us, Grizzly said. His voice shifted, not harder, just more direct. I'm here, so talk. Connor's fingers moved around the coin. Was my father one of you? The question clean and unadorned. Grizzly looked at the coin. He looked at Connor. Yes, he said. He was a member of this chapter for almost 3 years. Connor absorbed this. What was he like? And then something happened that Sarah had not expected, that she would think about for a long time afterward. Grizzly Thomas Henderson, president of the Spokane Hells Angels, a man who had sat across from her in a loud clubhouse and delivered the facts of Michael Hayes' life with a plainness that had made her want to sit down, looked at this 17-year-old boy in a hospital bed and made a decision. She could see him make it. It happened in the space of about 2 seconds, in the way his jaw moved and his hands settled on his knees and his eyes changed their quality. He made a choice. Your father, Grizzly said, was one of the most loyal men I ever knew. Connor went very still. Sarah pressed her hand over her mouth. He rode with us for 3 years, Grizzly said. His voice was level and certain. He had your back before you even finished a sentence. Fastest wrench in the shop, not bragging, just fact. He could fix an engine that everyone else had given up on. He paused. He had a laugh that you could hear across a parking lot, and he could talk to anyone. Didn't matter who you were, that man made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. Connor's eyes were very bright. He used to carry that coin, Grizzly said. He nodded toward Connor's hand. The one you've got. He said it was for luck. He rubbed the face off one side from handling it so much. A pause. He talked about you. Connor's lips parted. He did. Talked about a son he had in the city, said you were going to be smarter than him, which he thought was probably not a high bar, and funnier than him, which he thought was a very high bar. The edge of something real in Grizzly's voice, then something that hadn't been scripted. He wasn't wrong. Sarah understood in this moment exactly what Grizzly was doing. She understood it so completely that she couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only sit by the window and press her hand over her mouth and let it happen. He was giving her son a story worth dying in. Not the true story or not the whole true story. He was giving Connor the version that a boy who has run out of time deserves to have. The version where his father was real and loyal and thought about him. The version where the coin meant something good. It was a lie. It was the most merciful thing she had ever witnessed. What happened to him, Connor said. Grizzly was quiet for a moment. He died doing something that mattered. That's all I'm going to tell you, because the rest is ours to carry, not yours. What I will tell you is that we didn't forget him. We never forget our brothers. Connor looked at the coin. He was your brother. He was. A silence. The engines outside, low and constant. Then he was something, Connor said softly. He was part of something. Yes, Grizzly said, he was. Connor looked up. His eyes were wet. He didn't look away from Grizzly. He held the look directly, the same directness that had disarmed doctors and administrators and grief counselors for 11 months. Thank you, he said, For coming, for all of them coming. Grizzly looked at this boy, something in his face that Sarah couldn't name, not grief exactly, not pity, something harder and more private than both of those things. Nobody had to be asked twice, Grizzly said. He reached down and picked up the leather vest from his knees. And then he did something that Sarah Hayes would carry with her for the rest of her life, something she would try to describe to people in the years to come and always find the words insufficient for. He stood up, he shook the vest out carefully, and he leaned forward and laid it over Connor's body, over the blanket, over the hospital gown, over the boy who weighed 109 pounds and had 300 riders waiting for him outside. Connor looked down at it, then back up at Grizzly. "What does this mean?" he said. "It means you're one of us," Grizzly said, "if you want to be." Connor's hand moved to the leather. He pressed his palm flat against it. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely a sound. "Yeah, I want to be." Outside, as if the building itself had registered the moment the engines rose in a single unified wave. 300 throttles opening together in the night, a sound that climbed the walls of Spokane Memorial and moved through every floor and filled every room and reached every person in the building who was awake enough to hear it. The nurses at the station stopped what they were doing. In the room across the hall, an 83-year-old man named Earl, who had been fading in and out for 2 days, opened his eyes at the sound of it and didn't know what it was, but felt something, a vibration, a presence, a weight of human intention that came through the walls and reached him where he was. Connor Hayes lay in room 414 with a Hell's Angels vest across his body and a coin in his hand and a story his father never got to tell him, and he listened to 300 engines speak for every person who hadn't known how to. Sarah Hayes sat by the window with her hand over her mouth and let her son have this. Just this. This one true thing inside the lie, this one real thing underneath the mercy that people had come, that they had come for him, that no institution and no administrator and no liability concern had been able to stop them from coming. That the world contained people who drove through the night for a boy they'd never met because someone asked and it was the right thing to do. That part, at least, was entirely true. The engines didn't stop that night. They didn't stop at 10 o'clock when the hospital's security director called Callaway's cell phone for the 3rd time in 2 hours. They didn't stop at 11 when 2 Spokane police cruisers arrived at the access road and the officers inside them looked at what was assembled in the darkness and then looked at each other and made a collective wordless decision to call for guidance before doing anything else. They didn't stop at midnight when the charge nurse on the 4th floor came to the nurse's station and stood there for a full minute just listening, because there was nothing else you could do with a sound like that except stand still and let it move through you. 314 riders. That was the number that would appear in the Spokane Spokesman Review 3 days later, attributed to a source inside the police department who had counted headlights from the access road overpass. 314 from 11 different chapters across 4 states. Some had driven 8 hours. One group had come from Portland, another from Boise, a third from somewhere in Montana that nobody at the hospital had thought to ask about specifically. They came because the word had gone out, and when this particular word goes out in this particular world, people move. Connor knew none of the numbers that night. What Connor knew was the sound. He lay in a room 414 with Grizzly's vest across his body and the coin in his left hand and his eyes half open, and he listened. Sarah watched him listen. She watched the way his breathing, shallow too shallow, the kind of breathing that Dr. Marsh measured in days, seemed to steady itself against the rhythm of the engines outside, as if his body was borrowing something from the collective sound of them. Grizzly had stayed for 40 minutes. When he left, he shook Connor's hand. Not the careful, reduced handshake people give to sick people, a real one. Connor grabbed it back as hard as he could, which wasn't much, and Grizzly didn't make anything of the difference. At the door, Grizzly looked back. "Get some rest," he said. "You're not leaving," Connor said. "The engines are still going." Grizzly looked at him. "We'll be here. All night. However long it takes." Connor nodded. Something in the economy of it. No performance, no excessive sentiment. Just the flat statement of a man who meant it seemed to satisfy him in a way that no amount of reassurance from doctors or counselors or well-meaning relatives had managed in 11 months. "Okay," Connor said. Grizzly left. The door closed. Sarah and Connor were alone with the sound. "Mom," Connor said, "right here. Don't fall asleep tonight." She looked at him. "Connor, I know what that sounds like. I'm not—" He paused, recalibrating. "I just want you here. Awake. I want to talk." So they talked. They talked the way people talk when time has finally become undeniable. Not about the big things, or not only about the big things, but about everything in the order it surfaced. Connor asked her about the year he was born, what the weather was like, whether she'd been scared. She told him she'd been terrified and that it had been February and that the hospital room had smelled like floor cleaner and that the moment they handed him to her, she'd thought, oh, so this is the thing I was going to do with my life. He asked her about the guitar she'd bought him 3 Christmases ago and whether she still had it. She said it was in the closet at home and she wasn't going to talk about what she was going to do with it, not tonight. He said he wasn't asking about tonight, just about the guitar, and she said, fine, yes, she had it and she was keeping it. He said, good. They talked about a camping trip they'd taken when he was 9 to a lake in Idaho, whose name neither of them could fully remember, where Connor had caught his first fish and immediately wanted to put it back because it looked distressed, which he'd done, and then cried about it for 20 minutes. Not because he was sad, but because he was 9 and overwhelmed by having made a decision that felt important. Sarah had told him then that caring about things was not a weakness. Connor said he still thought about that fish. She told him she did too. At some point, after 1 in the morning, Connor said, did Grizzly tell you the truth about Dad when you went to the clubhouse that night? Sarah was quiet for a moment. He told me things, she said, but was what he told me tonight the truth? The questions sat in the room. The engines outside moved through the walls. Sarah looked at her son, at the person she knew better than any other person in the world, who had inherited her stubbornness and his father's magnetism, in some third quality that was entirely his own and that she had never successfully named, and she made a decision. He told you what mattered, she said. Connor considered this. That's not a yes. No, she said, it's not. Another silence. Connor looked at the vest on his body. His hand moved over the leather slowly. He was complicated, Connor said. Not a question. Yes. But he was real. Yes, very real. And he thought about me. Sarah held her son's gaze. I believe that's true, she said. Whatever else he was, I believe that part. Connor nodded. He didn't push further. He was 17 years old and running out of time, and he was wise enough or tired enough or simply brave enough to take the version that could carry him and leave the rest for a silence that would never be fully explained. Okay, he said. Okay, she said back. He slept at 2:15. Sarah did not. She sat in the chair and listened to her son breathe and listened to the engines outside and thought about Michael Hayes, about Grizzly, about the specific mercy of a lie told in a hospital room by a man who owed them nothing and gave them everything. She thought about Connor at 4 years old, standing at the front window of their apartment, waiting for a man who didn't come. She thought about what it had cost him to carry that weight for 13 years without letting it become bitterness, because it hadn't, she realized. He wasn't bitter. Connor Hayes dying at 17 of bone cancer was not bitter. He had decided he wanted to die curious, not afraid, and he had mostly managed it, and she did not know where that had come from inside him, but she suspected it was the part that wasn't her and wasn't Michael either. The part that was just him. The engines were still running at 3:15. At 3:40, Tyler knocked softly and came in for the overnight check. He moved quietly, aware of Connor sleeping. He checked the readings, made his notations, looked at Sarah. You should try to sleep, he whispered. Connor asked me to stay awake. Tyler looked at Connor. He looked at the vest. He'd seen it when he came in earlier and hadn't said anything about it, which Sarah appreciated more than she could express. The riders outside, Tyler said quietly. They've been there 6 hours. I know. Half the staff is losing their minds about it. A pause. The other half went to the windows. Sarah looked at him. Which half are you? Tyler considered. I checked the window twice, he said. Then I came back up here. He glanced toward the door. Dr. Wellman is still in the building. She came back at midnight. She's not on call. He said it the way people say things they think matter but can't explain why. She's just here. Sarah nodded. Tell her thank you. Tyler slipped back out. The shift change happened at 6. The morning light came back. Connor woke at 6:50 with a cough that lasted 2 minutes and left him exhausted in equanimity. His hand pressed to his ribs, his eyes squeezed shut, while Sarah held his other hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. When it passed, he lay back and breathed carefully. They're still there, he said. Not a question. He could hear them. Yes. How long has it been? About 9 hours. Connor absorbed this. The cough had cost him something visible. There was a grayness to his face that hadn't been there last night, a new depth to the exhaustion. Dr. Marsh arrived at 7:30 and did not say what her expression said, which was that the 72 hours she'd given them 3 days ago might have been optimistic. She adjusted medications. She spoke quietly to Sarah in the hall. His oxygen saturation is lower this morning, she said. We can put him on supplemental oxygen. It'll help with the breathing. It won't change the timeline, but it will make him more comfortable. Will he be able to talk? Yes, for now. A pause. Sarah, is there family you need to call? Anyone who hasn't come yet? There's no one else, Sarah said. It's just us. Dr. Marsh looked at her for a moment. It doesn't feel like just you, she said quietly. She meant the engines. They were still running outside lower now, cycling in rotation so that the sound didn't stop even as individual riders took breaks. The hospital had been living inside the sound for 9 hours. It had changed the texture of the morning. Staff moved differently, spoke more quietly, carried themselves with a particular careful awareness, as if the building itself had been consecrated by the attention of 300 people who refused to leave. At 8:15, something else happened. Denise, the senior floor nurse with 19 years on the oncology ward and opinions about hospital administrators, appeared in the doorway of 414 with an expression that was unprecedented in Sarah's experience of her uncertain. Denise was not uncertain. Denise was the fixed axis around which the fourth floor rotated. Mrs. Hayes, she said, there's someone at the nurse's station asking for you. Not a visitor, not family. She paused. Media. Sarah straightened. What? A reporter, local TV, and there's a photographer from the newspaper. Denise's voice was carefully neutral. Someone talked. It might have been one of the overnight staff, I don't know. But there's a camera crew setting up in the parking lot, and the administrator is... She stopped. Mr. Calloway is having another very bad morning. Sarah stood up. She looked at Connor, who had heard all of this. Don't, Connor said. Connor, don't talk to them. His voice was thin but definite. This isn't their story. They're going to report it whether we talk to them or not. Then let them. He looked at her steadily. But don't go down there. Stay here. She stayed. What happened outside the hospital in the next 3 hours was something none of them fully controlled. The camera crew filmed the riders. The riders did not engage with the camera crew. The reporter tried to get a statement from Calloway, who emerged briefly, said something about patient privacy and extraordinary circumstances, and went back inside. The riders continued to run their engines in rotation. The photographer got the picture that would run on the front page, an image of the access road lined with bikes and riders, and the hospital building rising behind them, the morning light doing something almost devotional with the chrome, though he would not use that word in his caption. By 10 o'clock, the story was moving through social media in ways that nobody in the building had anticipated. Someone had posted a video from a car window, 30 seconds of shaky footage of the formation with the caption, "They're all here for one kid and they won't leave." It had 60,000 views by noon. By late afternoon, it would have 2 million. By the time Sarah became aware of any of this, it had already happened. What she was aware of sitting in room 414 was the sound of Connor's breathing and the weight of the vest across his body and the coin in his hand and the question he asked her at 10:45. Are they going to make them leave? No, Sarah said, because she believed it. Grizzly said they'd stay. They'll stay. Connor nodded. He was quiet for a while. Then, I want to write something down. Sarah found paper in the bedside drawer, a notepad with the hospital's letterhead, the kind left for patients to write questions for doctors. She uncapped a pen and gave it to him. He held it for a moment, looking at the paper, then began to write. His handwriting was not what it had been. She watched the pen move slowly, deliberately. He wrote for 4 minutes, then he folded the paper once and held it out to her. Don't read it now, he said. She took it. She put it in her jacket pocket without reading it. It's not dramatic, he said. There were things I wanted to say while I still could say them clearly. He paused. There's one for you. There's one for Tyler because he wore cartoon dogs every shift for 4 months and nobody made him do that. And there's one, he stopped. There's one for Grizzly, in case I can't say it myself. Sarah pressed her fingers against the outside of her jacket pocket, feeling the folded paper. I'll make sure he gets it, she said. I know you will. Noon came. The sound of the engines continued steady, unbroken, the rotating relay of riders keeping the sound alive. Denise brought lunch that Sarah didn't eat. Tyler came by twice and didn't pretend to have clinical reasons for either visit. Dr. Wellman stopped in at 1:15 and sat for a few minutes and said almost nothing, which was the right thing. Connor slept between 12:30 and 2, and in that time Sarah stood at the window and watched what was happening outside. The formation had organized itself more deliberately in the daylight bikes arranged in rows along the access road and the edge of the parking structure, riders in small groups or alone, some sitting, some standing, some walking. Slowly. A few had brought food and were sharing it without ceremony. One man, enormous with a red beard down to his chest, was sitting on the hood of a car reading a paperback novel with the complete absorption of someone who had made peace with the wait. None of them looked like they were leaving. A woman had appeared at the outer edge of the gathering. Then two more, then a man with a young child on his shoulders. Civilians. People from the city who had seen the footage online and come to Sarah didn't know exactly. Be present. Bear witness. Whatever the word was for what people do when they feel the pull of something they can't fully explain, but understand is important. By 2 in the afternoon, there were perhaps 200 additional people gathered at the perimeter of what the riders had established. Not joining the formation, not intruding on it, just there. Spokane Memorial Hospital had become something it had never been before and would never be again. Connor woke at 2:10, looked at the window and said, "More people." He'd heard something in the change of the ambient sound, the crowd noise layering in under the engines. Sarah hadn't told him. He'd heard it. "Word got out," she said, "about me, about all of it." He was quiet. "I didn't want it to be a spectacle." "It's not," Sarah said, and she meant it because from where she stood looking out at what was assembled below, spectacle wasn't the right word. Spectacle implied performance, implied something put on for effect. This was different. This had the quality of something genuine and unplanned, like weather, like a tide, like the particular movement of people towards something real when they recognize it. People just came, she said, because they heard and they wanted to. Connor looked at the ceiling. His chest rose and fell. "Huh," he said. "Just that. Huh." As if the information was being filed somewhere he hadn't expected to need. At 3 o'clock, his pain spiked. It happened the way the pain always happened now. Not gradually, not with warning, but suddenly and completely, like a door slamming shut. Connor's body arched slightly against the mattress, his breath going short and sharp, his hand clenching around the coin until his knuckles whitened. Sarah was out the door and at the nurse's station before she'd consciously decided to move. Denise was already coming. The pain had been getting ahead of the medication in the last 2 days, requiring adjustments, requiring the kind of careful pharmaceutical arithmetic that Dr. Marsh was expert at, and that Sarah understood only in its results: Connor's breathing, Connor's face, the difference between controlled and not. The adjustment took 20 minutes and felt like 2 hours. When Connor's breathing leveled out and the terrible tightness left his face, he opened his eyes and looked at his mother and said with an exhausted black humor that was so purely him that it made Sarah want to laugh and cry simultaneously, "I'm really tired of that." "I know," she said. "Tell them to fix it. They're trying. Try harder." He closed his eyes again. "I have things to do today." The things he had to do, it turned out, required Grizzly. At 4:15, Connor asked for him. Not the hospital. Connor asked Sarah directly, and Sarah called the number, and Grizzly picked up on the first ring. "He's asking for you," she said. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Grizzly said. He was there in 7. He came in with 2 other men this time, large, quiet, positioned just inside the doorways in a way that was protective without being aggressive. They stayed at the door. Grizzly came to the chair beside Connor's bed and sat down. Connor's eyes were open. He looked worse than last night, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise, which seemed to be the correct approach. "I wanted to ask you something," Connor said. "Ask." "The men out there?" Connor's eyes moved toward the window, toward the sound that had now been going for more than 15 hours. "Do they know about me? Do they know why they're here?" Grizzly looked at him. "They know a kid asked to meet the Hells Angels and the hospital said no." "That's all. That's enough." Grizzly paused. "You don't need a bigger reason than that." Connor thought about this. "What about my dad? Do they know about him?" "Some of the older members remember him. The rest?" Grizzly paused. "The rest came because this is what we do for our own." Connor's hand moved to the vest, still covering his body. He'd asked that it stay there when the nurses made their morning checks, and Tyler had carefully worked around it. You said last night I was one of you. I did. Did you mean it? Grizzly looked at him directly. Would I be sitting here if I didn't? Something settled in Connor's face. I want to give something back, he said. To the men outside. To all of them. He paused, the effort of it visible. I know I can't go down there. I know I probably can't. He stopped, reorganized. Is there a way for them to hear me? Like, can you put me on a speaker or something so they know? I know they're there. Grizzly was quiet for a moment. He looked at Connor with the same quality of attention he'd given him the night before, the real listening, the kind that doesn't rush to fill silence. Yeah, he said. We can do that. I don't want to give a speech, Connor said quickly. I just want to say, I just want them to know. He stopped. Does that make sense? It makes sense. You'll do it. I'll handle it. Connor nodded. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. There's a letter, he said. For you. My mom has it. He looked at Sarah. Now is okay. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and retrieved the folded paper. She held it for a moment, then crossed to Grizzly and gave it to him. He took it without opening it. He put it in the inside pocket of his vest. I'll read it later, he said. It's not long, Connor said. I couldn't, he paused. My handwriting got bad, so I kept it short. Short is fine. There's one thing in it I need to say out loud too, Connor said, because I want you to actually hear it. He looked at Grizzly steadily. Thank you. Not for last night, not for the story you told me. I know it was, he paused, and Grizzly went very still. I know it was what you thought I needed, and you were right. But what I'm thanking you for is the men outside. That's real. That's not a story. 300 people came because a kid asked. That's the most real thing that's ever happened to me. His voice had gotten quieter but had not broken. So thank you for that. That part was true. Grizzly sat with this. He was quiet long enough that one of the men at the door shifted almost imperceptibly. Then Grizzly said, Your father would have been out there with them. You know that? Connor blinked. Something moved across his face. Yeah, he said softly. Yeah, I think he would have. The best version of him would have. Grizzly paused. People have more than one version. You know that. I know. The version that was out there on a bike with his brothers, that version would have driven through the night. Grizzly's voice was level and certain. No question. Connor held that. He pressed his palm flat against the vest one more time. At 4:50, Grizzly left the room and went outside. Sarah watched from the window. She watched him move through the formation to a position at the front, where someone handed him something she couldn't see clearly from the 4th floor. There was a brief exchange with 2 other riders. Then she saw him hold something up, a radio, or a portable speaker, or some combination of them. She couldn't tell exactly from here. Then the engines went quiet. All at once, all 300 of them together, as if a single switch had been thrown. The silence was so sudden and so complete that it felt physical, like pressure changing, like the moment after a sound you've been inside for so long that you stopped hearing it ends and you feel the absence of it in your body. In the hospitals and houses and businesses within earshot of Spokane Memorial, people stopped what they were doing. On the 4th floor, every nurse at the station looked up. In room 414, Connor Hayes opened his eyes. Sarah picked up her phone and called Grizzly. He answered and handed the speaker to whoever was holding it, and the connection opened, and for a moment there was nothing on the line but air and the faint ambient sound of the crowd gathered at the perimeter of the lot. Go, Grizzly said. Connor looked at his mother. She held the phone toward him. He thought for a moment. He had said he didn't want to give a speech, and he didn't. What came out of him was something more direct than a speech, 3 sentences delivered in the thin but a definite voice of a boy who had run out of time for anything that wasn't essential. I can hear you, Connor said. I've heard you all night. Thank you for not leaving. That was it. That was all. Sarah lowered the phone. Outside, through the window and through the walls, she heard the engines come back. Not all at once this time, one at a time, then 2, then dozens, building back in layers until the full sound was restored richer somehow than before, carrying something it hadn't carried before the silence. Connor listened. His eyes were closed. His hand was on the vest. Okay, he said quietly. To no one specifically. Or to everyone. Sarah couldn't tell. Okay. At 5:30, Dr. Marsh came back. She checked Connor's vitals, reviewed the medication chart, spoke quietly to Sarah outside the room. Tonight, she said, just the one word. The way she said it was not a guess. Sarah nodded. She went back inside. Connor was awake watching the door. She told you tonight, he said. Sarah sat down. She took his hand. Yes, he was quiet. The engines outside steady and constant. I'm not scared, Connor said. He sounded almost surprised by this. I thought I would be, but I'm not. You don't have to be anything, Sarah said. I know. He turned his head toward the window. I want to hear them when I go. Can they stay until... Yes, Sarah said. She didn't know exactly how she was going to ensure this. She would call Grizzly. She would handle it. They'll stay. Good. A long breath. Good. Tyler came in at 6 and readjusted the oxygen tubing and checked everything with careful hands and did not say goodbye because he was not the kind of person who could have said it without coming apart. And Connor understood this and didn't put him in that position. And when Tyler left, he said to his back, "Hey, Tyler." And Tyler stopped in the doorway and turned, and Connor said, "The dogs were a good call." And Tyler said, "I know," and walked out. Denise stopped by at 6:30 with tea for Sarah that Sarah didn't drink. She stood for a moment at the end of the bed and looked at Connor with 19 years of carefully maintained professional composure, and then said, You're something else, kid," and left before either of them could respond. Dr. Wellman came at 7. She sat for a little while and held Sarah's hand, which Sarah hadn't expected and which she accepted because she was tired enough that receiving kindness without deflecting it had become possible. At 7:45, Grizzly came back. He didn't stay long this time. He stood near the bed and looked at Connor, who was drifting, but surfaced when he heard the footsteps and looked up. "Still here," Grizzly said. "Still here," Connor said back. "All of us." "I know." Connor's voice was very faint now. The distance between the surface and the depth of him had gotten narrow. "Will you read the letter tonight?" "Already did." Connor's eyes moved to him. And Grizzly looked at this boy for a long moment. "You write better than your father," he said. Something in Connor's face, something that might have been the last available version of that near smile, the ghost of it, the structural memory of what it felt like to be amused. "High bar," Connor said so softly it was barely sound. "High bar," Grizzly agreed. He put his hand on Connor's shoulder briefly firmly, a real touch. Then he straightened and looked at Sarah. "We'll be outside," he said. "All night," she said. "However long it takes," he said. The same words as the night before. Not a formula, a commitment. He left. Sarah turned back to her son. Connor's breathing had changed in the last hour. It had taken on the quality that Dr. Marsh had described to her weeks ago when they'd talked about what to expect at the end, slower, with longer pauses between each breath, each one an event unto itself rather than part of a continuous rhythm. She counted the pauses without meaning to. She held his hand without meaning to stop. She listened to the engines outside the window, 300 of them holding steady against the April night, and she sat with her son in the room where he'd spent the last 11 weeks of his life, and she did not look away from his face. At some point after 8, Connor said her name. "I'm here," she said immediately. "Stay close," he said. "I am right here." He was quiet for a while. Then the sound. "Still there," she said. "They're still there, Sidell." "Good," he said. "That's good." The room held them both, the monitors, the low light, the coin in Connor's hand, the vest across his body, the sound that came through the walls and the glass and filled the space between everything with something that was not quite music and not quite silence, but somewhere between the two, which is the place where the most important things tend to live. Sarah Hayes held her son's hand and listened to 300 engines keep faith with a boy they had never met and would never stop having come for. Outside, the night deepened around Spokane Memorial, and no one left. The monitor changed its pattern at 9:17. Sarah heard it before she understood it, a subtle shift in the rhythm, the beeps spacing themselves differently, the sound becoming something that her body recognized before her mind caught up. She was holding Connor's hand. She had been holding his hand for 3 hours. Her fingers had gone partially numb, and she hadn't moved them because moving them felt like a risk she wasn't willing to take. The night nurse, a woman named Patricia, who had been checking in every 20 minutes with the quiet precision of someone who understood exactly what phase of this they were in, appeared in the doorway within seconds of the monitor change. She came in without being called, checked the readings, made a small adjustment, and looked at Sarah with an expression that communicated everything without words. Sarah leaned closer to Connor. His breathing had entered the territory Dr. Marsh had described. The long pauses, the shallow draws, the rhythm that was no longer a rhythm in the conventional sense, but something more elemental and less predictable. He had not spoken since the word good sometime after 8, but he had not let go of the coin. Sarah had checked. His fingers were still closed around it loosely now, the way a sleeping child holds something they carried to bed. Connor, she said quietly. His eyelids moved, not opening fully, just the flutter of someone surfacing briefly from a depth. I'm here, she said. Still right here. The engines outside had not stopped. 21 hours now. The riders had organized a rotation through the night that kept the sound continuous. Small groups cycling away to refuel. Other groups cycling back. The sound never dropping below a certain threshold, never falling into silence. Sarah had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a river when you've lived beside one long enough. It was simply part of the air now. Part of the room, part of what was keeping everything together. Patricia finished her check and touched Sarah's shoulder briefly on her way to the door. Do you want me to call Dr. Marsh? She asked quietly. Not yet, Sarah said. Then yes, call her. Patricia left. Sarah turned back to her son. The room was very quiet inside the sound. That was the paradox of it, 300 engines running in the night, and the room felt quieter than any room Sarah had ever been in. Like the sound had created a stillness rather than disturbing it. She thought about what she wanted to say. She had been thinking about it for days, the things a mother says to a child in this particular hour, the words that are supposed to carry everything across the threshold. She had written drafts in her head and discarded them because they all sounded like something borrowed from somewhere else, like the language of grief that circulates through culture and loses specificity in the circulation. What she said finally was not borrowed from anywhere. You were the best thing I ever did, she said. Not the hardest, though you were that too. The best. The thing I got most right. She paused. Everything I needed to know about being a person I learned from watching you figure out how to be one. I want you to know that. Connor's hand moved, not much, a small tightening around the coin, a pressure change in his fingers against hers. She felt it. I've got the coin, she said. When you're ready to let go, I've got it. His fingers didn't release. Not yet. At 9:41, Dr. Marsh arrived. She came in quietly, assessed quickly, and stood near the foot of the bed with the stillness of a woman who had been present for this particular threshold more times than she could count, and had never stopped treating each instance as singular. She looked at the readings. She looked at Connor. She looked at Sarah. He can hear you, she said. Until the end, he can hear you. Keep talking. Then she stepped back and gave them the room. Sarah kept talking. She talked about the camping trip and the fish. She talked about the guitar and the song he'd taught himself. She talked about the first day of kindergarten when he'd refused to cry and had instead shaken his teacher's hand, which the teacher had found alarming and which Sarah had found so perfectly, absurdly him that she'd had to wait until she got back to the car to laugh about it. She talked about the time he was 12 and had saved his lunch money for 3 months to buy her a birthday present and had presented it with the solemnity of a diplomat delivering a treaty. She talked about the way he said her name, Mom, the specific frequency of it, the way it changed depending on what he needed, how she could tell from the first syllable alone, whether he was hurt or frustrated or happy or just wanted to be in the same room as her. She told him she was going to be all right. She said it because she believed it was her job to say it and because she was going to make it true, even if it took her the rest of her life, and because the last thing she wanted to give her son on his way out of the world was something to worry about. Don't carry me, she said. Wherever you're going, just go. I'll be right behind you eventually. We've got time. At 10:15, the door opened. Sarah looked up. It was Grizzly. He hadn't knocked, or he had, and she hadn't heard, and Patricia had let him in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room with the speed of someone who has seen enough to know what he was looking at. He looked at Connor. He looked at Sarah. She nodded. He came in. He pulled the chair to the other side of the bed, the side that Sarah wasn't on, and sat down. He didn't say anything. He put his forearm on the edge of the mattress close to Connor's side, but not touching, and he sat. Sarah looked at him across the bed. Thank you, she said. Grizzly shook his head, not dismissing the thanks, just indicating it wasn't necessary. That he was here because this was where he was supposed to be. She understood. The three of them stayed that way, Connor in the center, Sarah on his left, holding his hand, Grizzly on his right, the sound of the engines filling the space around them like a held note. At 10:32, Connor opened his eyes. Fully open, not the flutter from before. Open with something in them that Sarah hadn't seen in days, a clarity, a presence as if some part of him had gathered itself for one final moment of complete attention. He looked at the ceiling first. Then he turned his head slowly to his left, to Sarah. She leaned in. "I'm here." He looked at her for a long moment, just looked, not speaking, not needing to. Then he turned his head to the right, to Grizzly. Grizzly met his eyes without flinching and without performing anything. Just looked back. Connor's lips moved. Sarah couldn't hear it from where she sat. Grizzly could, he was closer. She watched Grizzly's face when it happened. Watched the way something crossed it that he didn't try to hide, something she'd never seen on him before, something private and real. She would ask him later what Connor said. He would tell her. The answer would be two words. "Thank you." Connor Hayes closed his eyes at 10:34. His breathing slowed again. The pauses between each breath stretched until Sarah was counting the seconds of each pause and stopping when she got too high. Grizzly stayed where he was, his forearm on the mattress, his presence solid and quiet on the other side of the bed. Dr. Marsh was near the door. The monitor showed what it showed. At 10:49, the sound changed, not the engines outside, but the room's own sound. The monitor's rhythm, and Patricia came quickly, and Dr. Marsh stepped forward, and Sarah held Connor's hand through the final moment, because she had promised herself she would, and she did. The monitor line went flat at 10:51. The sound that came out of Sarah Hayes in the 60 seconds that followed was not something she chose or shaped or managed. It came from somewhere below, choice below language, the sound a person makes when the thing they have been bracing against for 11 months finally arrives and is both exactly what they expected and nothing like it at all. She pressed her forehead against Connor's hand, still holding the coin, and she let it out. All of it. Everything she'd held together through the oncologist's first phone call, and the staging conversations, and the weeks of adjusting medications, and the hospital administrator's polite refusals, and the drive across the city at midnight, and the night in the chapel. And every morning she'd walked into this room and smiled and said, "I'm right here." She let go of all of it for those 60 seconds. Grizzly didn't move from his chair. He didn't speak. He stayed where he was on the other side of the bed, and he let her have those 60 seconds without attempting to manage them, or soften them, or bring them to a close before they were finished. When she lifted her head, her face was entirely undone. Grizzly looked at her across her son's still body. "He wasn't alone," Grizzly said. "That was all, just that." Sarah nodded. She could not speak yet. "He knew people came for him," Grizzly said. "He heard them. He felt it." A pause. "That matters. That's not nothing." "No," Sarah said. Her voice was barely functional. "It's not nothing." Dr. Marsh came forward, then gently, and began the process of what came next, the clinical portion that couldn't wait, the notations and adjustments, and the sequence of small official acts that marked the end of one kind of time and the beginning of another. She worked quietly and with complete respect, and at one point she put her hand briefly on Sarah's shoulder and said nothing, which was exactly right. Grizzly stood. He straightened to his full height, which was considerable, and he looked at Connor one last time with an expression that Sarah could only partially read. It was the expression of a man filing something away, somewhere permanent, the look of someone who has decided that what happened in this room is going to be part of how he understands the world going forward. He reached out and adjusted the collar of the vest where it had slipped slightly. A small, careful gesture, making sure the thing that covered Connor's chest was properly placed. Then he stepped back. "I need to go outside," he said to Sarah. "Is that all right?" She understood what he meant. "Yes," she said. He walked out. What happened outside in the next 4 minutes, Sarah didn't see directly. She was with Connor, with his body, with the room, with Dr. Marsh and Patricia, who were both handling the necessary things with as much quiet as the situation allowed. But she heard it through the window. The engines stopped, all of them, together. The silence descended on the parking lot and the access road and the surrounding streets so completely and so suddenly that people 3 blocks away would later describe the moment as the thing they remembered most, Not the hours of engine sound, but the instant it ended. 314 riders. Silent. And then from outside, something else. A sound Sarah had never heard before and would never hear again in quite the same form. 300 people, riders and civilians. Both the crowd that had gathered through the day and stayed through the night, making a sound that was not quite applause and not quite a cheer, but something between them. Something that rose and held for a long moment and then fell back into silence. An acknowledgement, a tribute. The sound a crowd makes when it recognizes something sacred has happened inside a building it has been standing outside of for 21 hours. In room 414, Patricia looked at the window. She looked at Sarah. "They know," Patricia said quietly. Sarah nodded. She looked at her son. The coin was still in his hand. She reached over and gently, carefully loosened his fingers from around it. It took a moment. He had held it tightly enough that the impression of it was in his palm. She closed her own fingers around it and held it. She pressed it against her sternum and held it there. Grizzly came back 10 minutes later. He came back in with two other riders, men Sarah had seen at the door during his earlier visits, men who had been present without intruding through the entire process. They stood just inside the door, quiet, their hands at their sides, their presence doing something she didn't have a word for. Bearing witness, maybe. Standing in as the 300 who couldn't fit in the room. Grizzly looked at her from across the room. He looked at his vest still laid over Connor. "Leave it with him," Grizzly said. It wasn't a question. "We want him to have it." Sarah looked at the vest. She looked at her son. "I was going to ask you about that," she said. "Don't need to ask." He paused. "It was his the moment I put it on him. That's not something you take back." She looked at the vest for a moment longer. The death's head on the front, the patches on the back, the leather worn and creased in the way of something that had seen years of real use. She thought about what it meant in Grizzly's world to give someone a vest, the weight of it, the deliberateness of it, the irreversibility. "Thank you," she said. "Stop thanking me," he said, but he said it quietly and not unkindly. The next hour moved in the way that hours move when they contain too many different kinds of experience to be processed in sequence, administrative things and emotional things, and the logistical realities of death occupying the same narrow space as grief, which is always how it is, the paperwork arriving alongside the feeling, because the world doesn't pause for either. Dr. Marsh handled as much as she could. Tyler came by and stood in the hall and couldn't come in, and that was fine. Denise came and stood beside Sarah for a few minutes and didn't try to say the right thing, because she was wise enough to know there wasn't a right thing, and presence was what she had to offer. Richard Calloway appeared at 11:40. Sarah hadn't expected him. He stood in the corridor outside the room. He didn't come in, and when Sarah saw him through the open door, she wasn't sure what she felt. Not anger anymore. The anger had burned out somewhere in the last 24 hours. What was left was something more complicated and less directed. He said, "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Hayes, genuinely." She looked at him. "He heard them," she said. "All night. He heard them, and he wasn't alone." She paused. "I want you to know that." Calloway held her gaze. Something moved through his expression that she thought might be the beginning of understanding, the specific understanding of a man who made institutional decisions and was now standing close enough to the consequences of one of them to feel what it actually meant. "I know," he said. "I was wrong to wait as long as I did." It was a harder thing for a man in his position to say than it might have looked. She gave him credit for it. "Yes," she said simply, "you were." She went back into the room. At midnight, Grizzly found her sitting in the chair beside the bed, the chair she'd occupied for weeks, the chair that had its own history, now the chair where she'd made decisions and received news and held herself together through things that should have broken her and hadn't. He sat across from her. The room was quieter now, the official process mostly done. The space returned to something that felt more like private. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said. "Ask." "The letter, the one Connor wrote you." She looked at her hands. "What did it say?" Grizzly was quiet for a moment. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and took out the folded paper. He didn't open it. He held it in his hands. "He thanked me for the story," Grizzly said. "He said he knew it wasn't all true. He wanted me to know that he knew and that it was still the best thing anyone had ever given him." A pause. He said he understood why people need to believe the people they love were better than they were. He said he'd seen his mother do the same thing for years. Grizzly looked at Sarah directly. He said that mercy was a form of love and that he hoped I'd remember that. Sarah pressed her hand over her mouth. 17 years old, Grizzly said. Not in wonder exactly, in something more like reckoning. He was always like that, Sarah said. He was always 10 years ahead of where he should have been. The rest of the letter, Grizzly said, was for the men outside. He wrote something he wanted said to them. He paused. With your permission, I'd like to say it. Tonight, they're still out there. She looked at the window. The engines had not restarted after the silence. The riders were still there. She checked 20 minutes ago, looking down from the window. The formation still intact in the dark, hundreds of people who had stayed because leaving felt wrong. The civilians, too. The crowd that had come through the day and not dispersed. Yes, she said, say it. Grizzly stood. He put the letter back in his pocket. He walked to the window and looked down for a moment at what was assembled below, at the formation of people who had come for a boy they'd never met and stayed for 21 hours and gone silent when he left. Then he walked out. Sarah heard him on the phone as he moved down the corridor. She couldn't make out the words. She turned to the window. 2 minutes later, she saw a light in the formation below someone with a flashlight or a phone torch, a point of reference. Then Grizzly's voice came up through the window glass, amplified by whatever they'd set up before, the same system they'd used the night before when Connor spoke his 3 sentences into the phone. She couldn't hear the words clearly through the glass. She opened the window. The night air came in cold and clean, April doing its mild, indifferent thing. She heard Grizzly's voice clearly, then not loud, but carrying the way voices carry when the surrounding silence is complete. He read what Connor had written. Sarah didn't hear all of it. She heard pieces. She heard the word brothers used in a way she hadn't expected applied to people Connor had never met and would never meet. She heard something about sound, about how the thing he would carry was the sound of them, which had reached him when nothing else could. She heard something about his father, brief, without detail, just an acknowledgement that whatever his father had been, these men had come for his son, and that meant something. She heard the last line clearly, because Grizzly's voice changed when he got to. It changed in a way she'd never heard it change before, a crack in the professional stillness of him, quickly controlled but real. The last line was, tell them I felt it. That's all. I felt it. The silence that followed lasted long enough to be its own kind of tribute. Then one at a time, the engine started again. Not the full roar of before, something different, lower, steadier, a sound with more space in it, more intention. They built back up slowly, engine by engine, until the full formation was running again. But the quality of the sound had changed. It was still a motorcycle sound, still unmistakably what it was. But it carried something now, the way music carries something after you understand the context it was written in. Sarah stood at the window with her son's coin in her fist and let the sound move through her. She stood there for a long time. At 1:15 in the morning, Tyler found her. He'd clearly been trying to get himself together for a while and had mostly succeeded. He came and stood beside her at the window and looked down at what was still assembled below. I've been doing this job for 4 years, he said. I've never seen anything like this. No, Sarah said. Connor was, Tyler stopped. He looked out the window. He made everyone in this building better at their job this week. I don't know if that's weird to say. It's not weird, Sarah said. He had that effect. Tyler was quiet for a moment. The dogs, he said suddenly. He said the dogs were a good call. I know it's stupid, but that... He stopped. I'm going to keep wearing them. Sarah looked at him. He'd like that. Tyler nodded. He stood beside her for another minute, and then he had patients to check on, and he went to check on them because that was the job, because the job continued, because everything that continued did so around the space that Connor had occupied and would now not occupy the shape of him, still present in the air of the room. At 2 in the morning, Grizzly came back one final time. He sat across from Sarah in the chair. The room was quiet. Connor's bed had been. The process had been completed and the room had been returned to a kind of stillness. The vest was gone with Connor. The coin was with Sarah. They sat for a while without speaking. Then Sarah said, "What happens now for you, for the riders outside?" "They'll go home," Grizzly said. "Some of them tonight, some in the morning. They've got lives, families." He paused. "They'll go home different than they came. People do after something like this." Do you? She said. Go home different. He looked at her for a long moment. I haven't been home in 2 days, he said. When I get there, I'll let you know. It was almost a joke, almost. The letter, Sarah said. Can I have it back? Or did you want to keep it? Grizzly reached into his vest without hesitation and took out the folded paper and held it across the space between them. I read it 4 times, he said. I've got it. She took it. She held it without opening it. He knew, she said, about the story you told him. He knew it wasn't all true, and he took it anyway. I know, Grizzly said. He told me. He also believed the part about his father loving him. Good, Grizzly said. That part was true enough. Sarah looked at him. Was it? Grizzly met her eyes. Nobody's entirely one thing, Mrs. Hayes. I've known a lot of men in my life who weren't good by any reasonable measure and still loved their kids. Those things can both be true. He paused. Michael wasn't a man who deserved much, but the love was real. I believed it then, and I believe it now. She held this. Thank you for telling him what you told him, she said. And the facts, the other thing, the story. Grizzly nodded. It was the right call. It was the only call, she said. Yeah, he said. It was. Outside, the engines had settled into a low, continuous register, the sound of people who were preparing to leave but hadn't left yet, who were doing the thing people do when they've been present for something significant and can't quite make themselves move away from it. Sarah heard a shift in the pitch, several engines rising together, then others joining the formation, beginning to organize itself for departure, the way a crowd begins to move when the event is genuinely finally over. She stood and went to the window. Below, the formation was beginning to break, not chaotically, but with the same deliberate precision that had characterized everything they'd done for the last 22 hours. Bikes pulling out in sequence headlights, turning onto the access road, the column beginning to move. But slowly, respectfully, the way you leave a church, the way you leave a graveside, the way you leave any place where something has happened that you want to acknowledge the weight of on your way out. She watched the line of them move. 314 riders, all those engines, all that way, all that night. She pressed her hand to the glass. Grizzly came to stand beside her at the window. He watched his people go. Will you tell them, Sarah said, the ones who came. Eventually, will you tell them what it meant to him? They know, Grizzly said. He told them himself. She thought of Connor's voice through the phone, through the speaker, lifted up to 300 people in an April night. I can hear you. I've heard you all night. Thank you for not leaving. Yes, she said. He did. The last of the formation cleared the access road at 2:47. The sound diminished and then was gone, leaving the ordinary night sounds of the city, distant traffic, a siren somewhere to the west, the ambient hum of a place that didn't know what had happened inside this building tonight and would go on not knowing because the world is large and most of what matters happens inside it without announcement. Grizzly put on his jacket. Mrs. Hayes, he said. She turned from the window. He looked at her for a moment with the directness that was characteristic of him, the way he looked at things he was deciding how to carry. Your son walked into whatever comes next knowing people move mountains for him, he said. There's not a lot of people who get that. Most people die not knowing if they mattered. He paused. Connor knew. Sarah felt the coin against her palm. He knew, she said. Grizzly nodded once. He put out his hand. She shook it, a real handshake, the same kind he'd given Connor, and she gripped back the same way Connor had with everything she had left. He walked out. Sarah stood alone in the room 414, the room that had been her entire world for 11 weeks, that smelled of antiseptic and had bars of light through the blinds in a chair beside the bed that she'd sat in for hundreds of hours, the room where her son had listened to 300 engines and believed correctly that they had come for him. She stood for a long time. Then she picked up her jacket from the back of the chair and put it on. She felt the folded paper in the pocket Connor's letter, the one she hadn't read yet. She pressed her hand flat against the outside of her jacket where the letter was. Not yet. She would read it when she was ready to, which was not tonight, but would be someday. She knew the kind of thing it would say. She knew her son. She knew the specific economy of him, the way he said the most important things in the fewest words, the way he left nothing unsaid that needed saying, and nothing said that didn't need to be there. She knew it would be enough. Whatever was in it, it would be enough. She took the coin from her palm and looked at it one final time in the light of room 414. The face worn smooth on one side from decades of handling, from Michael Hayes' hands, before hers from Connor's hands, through 17 years from Grizzly's hands the night she'd laid it on the table between them. She turned it to the other side to the death's head, with its wings the symbol she'd spent 17 years trying not to look at directly. She looked at it now. She closed her fingers around it and put it in her pocket beside the letter. Then she walked out of room 414 down the corridor of the fourth floor of Spokane Memorial Hospital, past the nurse's station where Denise stood, and met her eyes and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment called for, and down the stairs and out through the front entrance into the April night where the last of the engine sounds had faded and the air smelled of spring, and the city was quiet and dark and entirely indifferently itself. She stood outside the building for a moment. She put her hand in her pocket, coin on one side, letter on the other. She stood there for a long time breathing, and then she walked to her car. She drove home in the dark with both hands on the wheel and nothing on the radio. The city passed around her the way cities pass around people who are no longer entirely present in them. The lights registering without meaning anything. The intersections arriving and receding, the familiar streets feeling like the streets of a place she had only read about and was now seeing for the first time from the wrong side of something. She drove the route she had driven twice a day for 11 weeks, and she did it from muscle memory alone, because the part of her that knew where she was going had temporarily vacated the premises. She parked in front of the house at 3:20 in the morning. She sat in the car for 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she watched the clock on the dashboard change and counted each minute as it turned. Not because she was waiting for anything specific, but because going inside felt like an act that would make something permanent, and she needed 11 minutes to be ready for permanent. The house was exactly as she'd left it 4 days ago, when she'd stopped coming home at night. The dishes she'd washed before Connor's first major decline were still in the drying rack. The mail had accumulated on the hallway table. The guitar was in the closet in Connor's room, and she knew it was there, and she did not open that closet door. She sat at the kitchen table and put the coin on the surface in front of her and looked at it. Then she took out the letter. She had told herself she would read it when she was ready. She understood now that ready was not a state she was going to arrive at through waiting. Ready was a decision the same way most of the things that had mattered in the last 11 months had been decisions to get up to go to the hospital, to drive across the city at midnight to hold her son's hand and not look away. She unfolded the paper. Connor's handwriting was difficult, the pen pressure, uneven, some letters larger than they should be, the lines not entirely straight. She had been prepared for this, and it still took her breath. She could see in the handwriting the exact amount of effort each word had cost him, the deliberateness of a person doing something important with a body that was no longer cooperating. He had written 3 sections separated by space on the page. The first was for her. It was 11 lines. She read it twice before she could process it as words rather than just the shape of his hand moving across paper. He thanked her for not lying to him about the hard things. He thanked her for driving across the city at midnight, which he called the most her thing she had ever done. He said she had given him a childhood that taught him how to be curious rather than afraid, and that this had turned out to be the most useful thing anyone had ever given him. He said he knew she was going to be all right because he knew her and that she was the most stubborn person he had ever met and that he was counting on that. The last line was, "Don't keep the guitar in the closet. Play it or give it to someone who will. It was his. Don't let it be a monument." She pressed her palm flat against the paper. She sat at the kitchen table until the light outside changed from black to gray to the particular thin blue of early April morning. She didn't sleep. She didn't try to sleep. She sat with the letter and the coin in the silence of the house, and she let the night finish becoming day without rushing it. At 7:15, her phone buzzed. She looked at it. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered, "Mrs. Hayes." A woman's voice. Professional, but not the professional of a hospital or a doctor's office, something else. "My name is Karen Elliott. I'm a reporter with KXLY. I know this is an incredibly difficult time, and I want to start by saying I'm so sorry for your loss." Sarah looked at the coin on the table. "I'm not giving interviews. I understand completely. I'm not calling to ask for one." A pause. I'm calling because I think you should know what's happening online with Connor's story. Sarah was quiet. The video from outside the hospital has 48 million views, Karen Elliott said. As of an hour ago, it's the most shared news content in the country right now. There are stories running in 17 countries. There are Mrs. Hayes, there are people all over the world talking about your son this morning. Sarah looked out the kitchen window. The morning was arriving the way April mornings arrive, without asking permission, indifferent to the weight of what the night before had contained. I don't know what to do with that, Sarah said. You don't have to do anything with it. Karen Elliott said, I just thought you should know. Connor's name is everywhere this morning. People know who he was. She thanked the reporter and ended the call. She sat for a while longer. Then she did something she had not expected to do. She picked up her phone and called Grizzly. He answered on the third ring. His voice had the texture of someone who had slept for 2 hours, which was probably accurate. Mrs. Hayes, did you know, she said, about the video, about how far it spread? A pause. I saw some of it this morning. Yeah. 48 million views, she said. I heard. What do you think Connor would say about that? She heard something from Grizzly's end that she'd never heard from him before, a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that family, brief and real and a little undone. He'd say something smart and deflating, Grizzly said. Something that made you feel like you were the one being too serious about it. Yeah, Sarah said. He would. A pause. How are you? The question's simple and direct, the way he always was. She thought about answering it with something managed and presentable. She decided against it. I don't know yet, she said. I'll let you know when I figure it out. Fair enough. Grizzly, she paused. Thank you for staying. Until the end. You didn't have to stay that long. Connor asked me to be there, he said. I was there. But I said, he didn't ask you directly. He asked if you'd come back. Same thing, Grizzly said. Close enough? She put the phone down. The days that followed were not linear. They had the quality of dreams that insist on their own internal logic, some hours very long and dense with feeling, others gone, before she could account for them, the overall shape of the week, not something she could have diagrammed if asked. She handled the necessary things. There were many necessary things. Death generates paperwork with the same indifference it generates grief, and the paperwork does not wait for the grief to finish. She had help she hadn't expected. Denise from the 4th floor called twice in the first week, not officially, not on behalf of the hospital, just as herself, a woman who had spent 19 years watching families navigate this particular country and had opinions about which resources were real and which were just procedures. Dr. Marsh stopped by in person one afternoon with a casserole and no pretense of a clinical reason for the visit, which Sarah found she was more grateful for than she could easily express. Tyler sent a text that said, only the dogs are still going, and she understood immediately what he meant and what it cost him to say even that much. And she texted back good and left it there. And then on the 5th day a box arrived. She almost didn't open it. It had no return address, just her name and address on the label, handwritten in a large, deliberate script. She set it on the kitchen table beside the coin, which hadn't moved from the spot she'd put it on the night she came home. She opened it. Inside was a leather jacket, not a vest, a full jacket, black with the kind of wear that indicated years of real use. Folded on top of it was a note. The handwriting was not Grizzly's. She'd seen his script on the outside of Connor's letter and knew its weight. This was someone else. The note said, my name is Ray. I rode from Portland. I've been riding for 30 years. I have a son. I wanted Connor to have this, but I was too late. So I want you to have it instead. Not as a symbol, just as something from someone who was there and wanted to give something real. You don't have to keep it, but it's yours. Below that, a phone number. Nothing else. Sarah sat with the jacket in her lap for a long time. She called the number. Ray answered on the first ring as if he'd been waiting. His voice was older than she'd expected. Graveled, careful, the voice of a man who chose words with the deliberateness of someone who hadn't always done so and had learned the cost of carelessness. I got your jacket, she said. I wasn't sure you'd call. I almost didn't. A pause. How are you doing, Mrs. Hayes? That question again. She was getting asked it constantly now by everyone in the earnest and helpless way people ask it when they know the answer is too large for a true response. From Ray, though, it didn't feel like a formula. He'd driven 8 hours and stood outside a hospital all night for a boy he'd never met. He had some claim to the question. "I'm getting through the days," she said, "some of them faster than others." "That's all it is for a while," he said, "just getting through." "You said you have a son." "Marcus, he's 23. A pause. "When I saw the video, when I heard what Connor asked for and why I called Marcus that night. Just to talk. We haven't really talked for about 2 years. Stupid reasons." His voice was careful and steady. "We talked for 3 hours. Sarah pressed her hand over her eyes. "Tell him," Ray said. "That's what I want you to know. Connor made me call my son. I think he's doing that for a lot of people right now. I think that's what 48 million views actually means." She couldn't speak for a moment. "Thank you for the jacket," she said when she could. "Thank you for letting him ask," Ray said. "For driving across that city. A lot of people in your situation wouldn't have." "He didn't leave me much choice," she said. "He never did." Ray laughed, a real laugh, warm and brief. "Sounds right," he said. She hung up and sat with the jacket across her knees and thought about 48 million people watching a video of an access road lined with bikes and a hospital building in Spokane, Washington, and some subset of those 48 million calling someone they hadn't called in too long, and some subset of that subset having the conversation they had been avoiding, and the chain of it moving out through the world in ways that Connor Hayes would never know about, and that she was only beginning to understand were real. She put the jacket across the back of the kitchen chair. She picked up the coin. She had been thinking in the days since the hospital about what to do with it. The coin felt like it had a specific gravity now too heavy to put in a drawer, too present to ignore. It had passed through Michael Hayes' hands and Connor's hands and Grizzly's hands, and hers had been carried and held and pressed into palms in moments of significance, and it was worn smooth on one side from all of that, from decades of being held by people who needed something to hold. She thought about what Connor had said he wanted to know if his father was part of something real. The answer she understood now was complicated in the way that real answers to real questions always are. Michael Hayes had been part of something real and had corrupted his part of it and had run from it and had left behind a boy who turned the coin over for 17 years without knowing what it meant. That was true. All of it was true. But Connor Hayes had also been part of something real, the most real thing Sarah had ever witnessed. He had been 17 years old and dying, and he had made a request that the world called impossible, and the world had been wrong, and 314 people had driven through the night to prove it. He had spoken 3 sentences into a phone, and the sentences had moved through 300 people, and then through 48 million more, and were still moving, still making Ray call Marcus, still making strangers dial numbers they'd been afraid to dial. That was also real. That was also the coin. She held it in her palm and felt its weight and understood that what she was holding was not just a Hells Angels token or a dead man's relic or a dying boy's comfort object. She was holding the proof of a specific and irreducible fact that Connor Hayes had existed, and that his existence had mattered, and that the world was measurably different for it. She closed her fingers around it. On the 9th day after Connor died, Sarah Hayes drove across the city to the industrial district near the rail yards. She hadn't called ahead. She wasn't sure why. Some part of her felt that calling ahead would make it official in a way that required her to know what she was going to say before she said it, and she didn't know what she was going to say. She only knew she needed to go. The gate was open in the daylight. She parked and walked up to the door and knocked. A man she didn't recognize answered, younger than the gate guard she'd met that first night, with a wariness that shifted slightly when she said her name. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Yeah, come in." Grizzly was in a back room that served as an office in the way that spaces serve as offices when their primary purpose is something else, desk against one-wall paperwork that looked like it hadn't been touched in days, a coffee maker doing the most serious work in the room. He stood when she came in. He looked at her face with the directness he always had, reading whatever was there without commenting on it. "You didn't call," he said. "I know. Sit down." She sat. He sat across from her. The coffee maker finished its cycle and neither of them moved toward it. "I got a box from someone named Ray," she said, "a writer from Portland." "I know Ray." He said Connor made him call his son. Grizzly looked at her. "Ray's been trying to call Marcus for 2 years. He called him that night. 3 hours. Something moved through Grizzly's expression. Not surprised she suspected already heard versions of this was already accumulating these stories the way people accumulate the secondary effects of something that has moved through their community. Good, he said. That's good. Are there more? Sarah said. Stories like that. People who, yes, he said simply. There are more. She nodded. She looked at her hands. I came because I needed to ask you something, and I needed to ask it in person. Ask. She looked up. What do we do with this, with what happened? Because I don't think it's finished. I don't think it's supposed to just end. She paused. Connor didn't have a big life measured in years. He had 17. But what he started, I don't know what to call it. I don't want it to be a viral moment that people forget by next week. I don't know how to make it more than that, but I feel like I'm supposed to try. Grizzly was quiet for a long moment. There's a kid, he said finally, in Coeur d'Alene, 14 years old. Bone cancer, same as Connor. His mother reached out to us 3 days ago. He paused. She saw the video. She said her son watched it 17 times. Sarah's chest tightened. What does he want? Same thing Connor wanted, Grizzly said. Differently, he doesn't have the history with us that Connor had. He saw what happened and he wants to know if it's real. If people actually show up like that. Do they? Grizzly looked at her. We went yesterday, he said. 12 riders. Walked into that hospital, sat with the kid for 2 hours, took him outside in a wheelchair to see the bikes. He paused. His name is Danny. He hadn't smiled in 3 weeks, according to his mother. Sarah pressed her fingers against her mouth. That's what we do with it, Grizzly said. That's the answer to your question. He leaned forward slightly. Connor asked us to show up. We showed up. Now we keep showing up. Not for attention, not for the cameras, because it turns out that this is something we can do that nobody else is doing, and when you find something like that, you do it. Is that because of Connor? She said. Is that new? We've done things like this before, Grizzly said. Smaller, quieter. The scale is new. The clarity about it is new. He paused. Connor made it clear. That's what he did. He made it clear that this is worth doing. She looked at him. Can I be part of it? The question surprised him. She could see that it surprised him, a small shift in his expression, a brief recalibration. What do you mean, he said. I mean Danny and Coeur d'Alene, she said. And whoever comes after Danny, I'm a mother, I speak that language. I know what it's like to be on the other side of what you do, to be the person sitting in the hospital who doesn't know if anyone's coming. She paused. I can help, if you'll let me, not as a Hell's Angel, as the person I am, as Connor's mother. Grizzly looked at her for a long moment. The way he looked at her then was different from every other time he'd looked at her. Not softer exactly, something more like recognition. The mother who drove across the city alone at midnight, he said. That's me. He nodded, slowly, definitively. Yeah, he said. All right. She drove home different than she'd arrived. Not fixed, she understood that fixed was not a destination she was going to reach in any simple or linear way, but different in the way of someone who has found the first foothold, the first specific thing that the next step can be taken toward. She went to Connor's room that afternoon. She stood at the door for a moment before going in, doing the thing she'd been doing every time she approached, gathering herself, remembering how to walk into a space that was full of someone no longer in it. She went in, she went to the closet, she opened it. The guitar was where it had always been, a mid-range acoustic she'd bought him for Christmas 3 years ago, still in decent condition because Connor had been careful with it, even when his hands made playing difficult. She lifted it out. She sat on the edge of his bed and held it across her knees the way you hold something you haven't decided what to do with yet. Don't let it be a monument. She couldn't play. She'd never learn. But she knew someone who could, a woman in her building, a retired music teacher named Gloria, who was 71 and played beautifully and had offered more than once to teach her something and been politely declined. Sarah had declined because learning something new had felt like an indulgence she didn't have time for, which was the kind of thinking she was going to have to stop. She carried the guitar out of Connor's room. She called Gloria. I have a guitar, she said. My son's guitar. I want to learn to play one song. I don't know which one yet. Can you help me figure that out? Gloria said yes immediately in the warm and unhesitating way of someone who has been waiting to be useful. Sarah hung up and stood in the hallway with the guitar and thought about Connor at 14 sitting in the same hallway working through the same instrument for 6 months to learn one specific song because he had decided he wanted to know it. She had asked him why that song, it wasn't a famous song, wasn't something she recognized. He'd said he heard it somewhere, and it sounded the way he wanted to feel. She hadn't asked what he meant by that. She wished she had. She wished she had asked him 100 more questions than she did, the way you always wish, the way the specific regrets of parenthood are always about the questions you saved for later and then ran out of later. But she remembered the sound of him playing it. She would find it. She had time now. Not the endless time of before it happened, not the compressed, urgent time of during, but the different time that comes after the time that requires you to learn a new way to fill it. She put the guitar on the kitchen table beside the coin. Two objects. His. She looked at them for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and looked up Danny's mother. It didn't take long. The story was still circulating, still attaching to itself new names and new faces, and Danny's family was part of the visible edge of it, a local news story from Coeur d'Alene that had been picked up because of the connection to Connor and the Spokane riders. Danny's mother's name was Christine. She was 43. The article had a photo, a woman with dark circles under her eyes and a smile she was clearly producing for the camera, because she understood that was what the moment required, and Sarah recognized the smile immediately because she had worn it herself for the better part of a year. She wrote Christine an email. She wrote it carefully the way Connor wrote carefully, no extra words, nothing that didn't need to be there. She said, "My name is Sarah Hayes. You may have heard of my son, Connor. I heard about Danny from a mutual friend. I don't want to intrude and I don't want to make your difficult situation about something other than your son. I just wanted to say that I know what it is to be where you are, and I know that people show up in ways you don't expect. I'm one of the people who will show up if you want me to." She sent it. She closed the laptop. She picked up the coin and turned it over in her fingers, the worn side, the smooth face where the years had erased whatever had been stamped into it, and the other side, the death's head with its wings and its letters. She had looked at this thing 10,000 times in 17 years and seen it differently each time. She saw it differently now than she'd seen it even a week ago. It wasn't Michael's anymore. It wasn't a relic of a dead man's bad choices. It wasn't the emblem of the world that had taken him and made him worse and then failed to hold him. It was the thing that had traveled from his hands to Connor's hands to hers, the thing that had been on Connor's nightstand when Grizzly came into the room and changed the story's ending, the thing Connor had held through the night of 300 engines and through the morning that followed and through everything until the final moment. It was a connector. That was what it had always been. Connecting things that shouldn't have connected a dead man to his living son, a dying boy, to 300 strangers, a mother to a world she hadn't known was there. She was going to keep it, not as a monument, not as a memorial, as what it was, a worn silver coin that had passed through enough hands to lose its original face and gain something better, something that couldn't be stamped in a factory, but only accumulated through the movement of people toward each other across the distances they'd allowed to grow between them. She put it in the pocket of her jacket, the same jacket she'd worn to the clubhouse that first night, the same pocket where the coin had ridden across the city while she drove towards something she didn't fully understand, but knew she needed to reach anyway. She left it there. An hour later, Christine replied to her email. The reply was short and raw in the way of someone who had been running on empty for long enough that the ordinary social padding of language had become impossible. She wrote, "Please come. Danny would like to meet you. He keeps asking if the woman who made it happen is real." Sarah read the message 3 times. She sat with it. Then she wrote back, "I'll be there Friday. And tell Danny I'm real." All of it was real. She closed the laptop and picked up her phone and called Grizzly. "Friday," she said when he answered. "I'm going to Coeur d'Alene to see Danny and his mother. Can you come?" A pause. "Yeah," he said. "I'll bring some people." "Not a production," she said. "Just people showing up. Like it should be." "That's what we do," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm starting to understand that." She set the phone down. She sat in the kitchen of the house she had lived in for 17 years, the house that had Connor's guitar on the table, and Connor's coin in her pocket, and Connor's letter in her jacket, and all of Connor's 17 years in every corner of it, and she understood something she had been circling for a week without landing on. The story was not over because Connor was gone. The story was not over because 48 million people had watched a video and moved on. The story was not over because the engines had finally left and the hospital had returned to its ordinary self, and the cherry trees outside the fourth floor window were still doing their indifferent April thing. The story was not over because Connor Hayes had done what he set out to do. He had wanted to know if people show up, if the world, when asked directly and clearly by someone who needed it, is capable of showing up. He had asked the question with his whole life, with every breath he had left in those last days, with 3 sentences spoken into a phone in a hospital room to 300 people waiting in the dark. And the answer had come back so large and so undeniable that it had moved through 48 million people and was still moving, still reaching places no one had mapped, still finding its way to Christine and Coeur d'Alene and Ray in Portland, and 100 Rays the world hadn't named yet. The answer was yes. People show up. They drive through the night. They stand outside a building for 21 hours in the dark. They call their sons. They write letters to strangers. They carry a worn silver coin across the city at midnight and knock on a door they're afraid of and refuse to leave until someone listens, because the person they love is asking for something real, and real is the only thing worth giving. Connor Hayes had known this. He had known it the way children sometimes know things before the adults around them have worked it out, not through experience, but through some clarity of vision that doesn't survive intact into the years of accumulation and compromise and learned fear. He had known people show up. He had just needed the world to prove him right, and the world had. That was the story, not the death, not the disease, not the administrators who said no, and the institution that took 2 days to become human about it. The story was the proof. 314 engines in an April night, a father's coin in a son's dying hand, a mother who drove across the city alone and knocked on the wrong kind of door because her son asked her to, and she was above all things and in every version of herself someone who showed up. Sarah Hayes put her hand over her jacket pocket where the coin waited. She thought of Connor's face in the last light. She thought of what he'd said to the formation, "I can hear you. I've heard you all night. Thank you for not leaving." She thought of Grizzly's voice when he read the last line of the letter to 300 people in the dark. "Tell them I felt it." She put on her jacket, she picked up the guitar, she walked to the door. Connor Hayes had asked a dying question, and the world had answered it with everything it had, and the answer was permanent now, written into what had happened and unchangeable by anything that came after. And the answer was this: he was never alone. He was never nothing. He was loved by people who drove through the night for him, and the sound of them reached him where he was, and he felt it, and that was enough, and it was everything, and it was true.